very, very popular, in particular in the scientific revolution, to affirm that space and time are these distinct divine attributes. So God is time. And you're like, whoa, what does that mean? And you're like, well, God's the natured entity that makes change possible. He's the source of the moments. And then whatever theory of providence you affirm, that's the story of how God unifies a series of moments into a coherent timeline.
Welcome back to Curious Christianity. Have you ever wondered about God and time? Maybe you've wondered, what is time? How does God enter the world? And does he even interact with us inside of time? Well, today I have a very special guest, Ryan Mullins, who has thought about this subject so that we don't have to. So I'm very excited to talk with him about time. He has written a book, and is actually called The End of the Timeless God. And somehow he has managed to have the time to write 4 other books beyond that one. So with me is Dr. Ryan Mullins. Ryan, welcome to the channel.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I just have to ask this. How did you even get involved in this subject?
So actually, it goes back to when I was 16. I was at a private Christian high school, and in an English class, we were reading C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And I can't remember if I actually read it or not at the time, because I was 16 and I had undiagnosed ADHD, so I wasn't really reading a whole lot. But the discussion in class that day, the teacher, it was on this chapter in Mere Christianity where Lewis says, he starts it with something like, "This is a chapter you may want to skip." And the English teacher is like, "You will not be skipping it. You need to read it." I'm like, sure. And it's about like God and time and how God answers prayers, and it's like all this kind of stuff. And there was this moment where like, the teacher got really animated. She's like, he's saying God's outside of time. If that's not blowing your mind, then you're not paying attention. And that moment, it actually did blow my mind when she pointed that out. And it was one of these moments where I just really felt called to worship God. And so I just needed to know, what exactly does this mean? What exactly is God's relationship to time? And then from there, I got addicted to philosophy and theology and got all these advanced degrees. And then now I've written 2 books on the topic. And yeah, and here we are.
Well, and on all of that, your title on Twitter and other stuff is The Reluctant Theologian. Why is that? How did that come about?
So my PhD, the first PhD, was not a pleasant experience. It was actually quite terrible. And there were a lot of times where I was like, I don't even want to be associated with this university. And then this is the moment where it really sank in. You have to do your defense, like your oral defense of your dissertation. In Scotland, we call it your viva. And so I passed my viva, and then I'm like, okay, cool. I guess I'm officially a theologian now. And the very next day, I attend a conference that was in town, and it was a conference on the Trinity. And I won't say what book came out of that, because then people might figure out who this was. But there was a theologian that goes up there and he's like, God's not a thing. God's not a being. God's an event. God's a happening. And he just keeps starting like spewing all this like beatnik poetry all of a sudden. And I'm just sitting there going, oh my goodness, I can't believe I just got a PhD in this. Like, I really just wasted my life. What am I doing? So I was just like, I should have just done pure philosophy and just ignored this. I'm glad I did not do that. I'm glad I did the theology, but it was one of these moments, and I've had many of them, where I look at the state of theology and I go, what is this? Like, what are we doing here? So yeah, that's the origin.
Well, so, okay, since you've been in academia, I don't know a nice way to ask this, but do you feel like it is full of a bunch of pompous, ridiculous arguments on some level?
Yeah, I mean, there's just no. I mean, yeah, there is a lot of that, and like, here's like, I can give you a million examples, but I'll give you one. So one of the things people really like about a lot of my writing is it's so clear, they can follow it, they can understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And during my PhD, I had people telling me to stop writing so clearly. No one's going to take you seriously if you write so clearly, because then they can understand you. And I'm like, the goal is to be understood. Like what is this? Yeah. So because I didn't write like a really posh wanker, like everybody was there were some people who did look down on me at times. It was weird.
Well, you know what? It's to me, that is what separates you in one aspect. And that's also, to me, what has also separated great other thinkers like Alvin Plantinga. I
Mhm.
love listening to Plantinga because when I listen to him, it's like, oh wow, that makes sense. Even though his writing to me is much more frustrating because he brings up 10 arguments, each of which you're just like, wow, I'm totally convinced. And then he destroys it in front of you.
I
You're like,
know.
oh my gosh, I can't keep going.
Your heart just can't take it.
Um,
You're like, yeah, this is so
yeah,
plausible. Oh gosh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Flanagan does that very well.
yeah. But I had another professor that I talked to once. He's got like 2 PhDs, teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary. And when I was young, I had a big axe to grind against academia. And he was 10 times as brutal. He was just so harsh against. He's like, they're so pompous, ridiculous. They're a bunch of morons. And his one quote that I took away from him was, he's like, it's amazing how much light the Bible sheds on commentaries. That was his quote. He's just like, and he literally told me, he's like, dude, I could just burn most of my commentaries or all the commentaries on the wall. He's like, stick with the Bible. And like, that's what really works.
Yeah.
So
So one of the things I will say though is, so like I'm part of this movement called analytic theology, and the thing I liked about it was everyone was just like, "Well, let's just say what you mean and mean what you say," and I'm like, "Oh, okay." And a lot of the people that I've met in these analytic theology circles have been really lovely. They're not really full of themselves. You meet a few every now and then, but like for the most part, they've just been very down to earth, and it's been very refreshing because other academic circles I run in, I'm like. Mm, okay.
yeah, that's to me been one of the really big struggles. Just as I get further into studies, like sometimes I'm just reading stuff and I'm like, how does that make sense? Like it just seems like a contradiction. Like I don't know any way around it. And that's actually one reason I want to talk to you about the subject of time, is
Mhm.
because that is a major issue that I felt like going into a lot of these theological discussions where we're like trying to talk about God, or I don't know, a handful of subjects, incarnation. How does God do this? How does God do that? And then they pull out the time card. Well, God's outside of time. So basically,
Mhm.
we don't have to explain. Like that's the end of the
Yeah.
discussion. God's out of
Mhm.
time. So we're done. So I would like to start with the first question of what is time? Because it is the most fundamental question. And as many people have talked about it, it's also one of the most difficult subjects there is. Like the simple definition of like, what is it? How do we even get our minds around answering that question?
Mhm. Yeah, this is something that I didn't even have clear in my head when I wrote the first book, The End of the Timeless God. It's not something until the book that comes out next month, From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker. That's where it was writing that book where I finally was like, okay, here we go. And here's the reason. When you look at the history of the philosophy of time, and not just in the Christian tradition, I'm talking like all the different religious and philosophical traditions, there's a long standing issue of people just refusing to even bother to define what time is. They're just kind of like, oh, you know the thing. And I'm like, no, I don't. Please tell me. And and so that really bothered me. And I found like other philosophers in like in our own age who were also bothered by that. But hardly anyone still wanted to tackle it. So to give you an example, so I'm a part of the Society for Philosophy of Time, and so I'm in I think it's I can't remember if this was in Germany, if it was in Austria. It might have been one of the meetings in Germany. And I said, the question that bothers me the most is what is time? And everyone laughs because they're like, we don't know. And I'm surrounded by like all these like, like the greatest experts in there. And then the same thing
Yeah.
happened when I went to the Higgs Center for Theoretical Physics. I was like, let's do a conference together. They're like, cool. And I was like, want to do it on what is time? And they're like, so all these physicists at the Higgs Center for Theoretical Physics, they start like, like getting scared. They're like, we don't know what time is. That's your job. as a philosopher. I was like, you know. So no one wants to talk about what is time, and that's super annoying. So there's two different views at the end of the day, really, like on what time is. You either think time is an actual thing that exists in the world, like it's an actual like substance,
Mhm.
or you think that it's time's not actually a thing that exists at all. You can just kind of reduce it down to something else in the world. Like maybe it's like a relationship between different things, or maybe it's just like a way of talking about clocks, or like this is sometimes called the relational or the reductionist view. So let's start with the relationalist view because this is the most popular view throughout
Okay.
history. But one of the criticisms of it is it's been so popular that hardly anyone bothers to even define it. So you don't really know what they're saying, and you're like, cool, great.
So
So
it's kind
you'll
of another
sometimes
spot
see,
where, oh, sorry. It's
well,
kind of
yeah,
another
well,
spot where
we're
people just
exactly,
kind of assume and then they just
mhm,
move on from there.
yeah, exactly. So they'll say things like, time is the measurement of change, and you're like, okay, cool. You'll see that a lot. And you're like, well, tell me what change is. And they're like, well, change is something being in different ways at different times. And I'm like, so time is the measure of change, but change is time. So time is the measure of time. Is that what you're saying? Like that sounds stupid. I'm sure that's not what you meant to say. Uh, Here's another account. People will say time is a relationship between events. And you're like, ooh, okay, cool. Tell me more. What are these events? Well, events are substances having properties at a time. And you're like, ah, okay. So we just brought time back in. So time is an event, but events are got time in there. And you're like, oh, all right, cool. That doesn't sound very helpful. And so you see these like sort of like circularity problems pop up. And this is not new. Like Aristotle had these problems, and Galen, there's this like philosopher and medical doctor at the time, pointed out some of these to Aristotle. And Aristotle would then start trying to choose his words very carefully to hopefully avoid these problems, but then you get left with this nebulous sort of mess. And so I'm like, well, that's just a mess. Get rid of it. So there's this other view, though. It's called the absolute theory. There's different versions of it, but the idea is that time is actually this substance, this thing, this natured entity that exists in the world, and it plays different roles. It does several different things to explain various features of reality. So one of the things it does is time explains how change is even possible. And you're like, okay, okay. And then time is the source of moments. So a moment is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. Because at the next moment, things could be different. Like I could stand up at the next moment. But right now, it's just this way. Time is the thing that's the source of those moments. And then we often talk about timelines. And then we love to do this with like in like sci-fi stories where you can like kind of fiddle with the timeline or something. But when you get rid of sci-fi and actually start talking about reality, there's this question of how does this series of moments actually get ordered into like a coherent timeline? Like what unifies all these different moments? Because it can't be like, well, this moment it comes, it's gone. Now this other moment's there. What explains all of that? And the idea is, well, time is the thing that's unifying that series of moments. So here's the further step, though, that doesn't get talked about as much because the history of philosophy of science doesn't always like to acknowledge that Isaac Newton like believed in God and was a Christian. So sometimes people want to get rid of the whole God stuff. But when you bring in the God stuff, you start to see that it was actually very, very popular, in particular in the scientific revolution, to affirm that space and time are these distinct divine attributes. So God is time, and you're like, whoa, what does that mean? You're like, well, God's the natured entity that makes change possible. He's the source of the moments. And then whatever theory of providence you affirm, that's the story of how God unifies a series of moments into a coherent timeline. And so you can say, like, yeah, it makes sense to attribute time to God.
Okay, so I have a question about that. Because I
Mhm.
think your wording is very specific. So you said makes time possible, but you did not
The
say,
change.
yeah, makes change possible, right? But you did not say like causes time, right?
Mhm. Right.
Well, because for example, this would fit into a classic philosophical problem. Like if you had said like God makes change happen, And then it runs into that old question about like, okay, how does time begin if there's an infinite
Mhm,
sequence of eternal moments prior? So
mhm.
if God is time, how does that solve that philosophical problem? Because the question is like, okay, well, then God is somewhat, I would say that God is philosophically impossible because you cannot have
Mhm.
infinite number of sequential moments in the past. Therefore, if God is time, God, it can't be real. It's not possible. How does that work?
Right. Yeah, so this is really good. So there's a few different things going on in some of these debates, and so I'm not the first person to solve this problem. There's people in the past. There's this guy named al-Baghdadi in the 1000s in the Islamic tradition who's going to give you the answer I'm about to give you, and then Richard Swinburne does something pretty similar. So actually, okay, there's two different answers. One is you could just go, "There's nothing wrong with infinities. Who cares?" So like you see Isaac Newton and Samuel Clarke do that. William Hasker is a contemporary philosopher, and he's just like, what's this infinite regression? What's the problem? And they just kind of shrug their shoulders, like, like no big deal. Whereas like I think there is a problem here. I really do. I like all the Kalam kind of stuff that bothers me.
Mhm.
So what you have to do is you have to look really carefully at a couple different assumptions that are at play here. One of which is you have to ask the question, what does it mean to begin to exist? Because God is eternal, and what it means to be eternal is that you don't begin to exist and you never cease to exist. So you have to ask, well, what does it mean to begin to exist? And there's a very clear answer in the Western philosophical and Eastern philosophical traditions. And the answer is something begins to exist if it is preceded by non existence. So first there's nothing, and then there's something. And so when you talk about creation out of nothing, for example, the claim is you've got God all alone, no universe, and then God plus a universe, because the universe begins. So it's preceded by its
Mhm.
own non existence. Well, with God, you would just say, well, God's eternal, so he's not, he never begins to exist. So God doesn't there's no state of affairs where God does not exist. And so what you do now then is you can say, prior to creation, there's a single moment. That's it. Just a way things are that could be otherwise. So there's God hanging out by himself doing nothing. And that's the way things are. Did that moment begin? No, because it's not preceded by non existence. There's just God and that's it. And then the next moment is when God does something. And so you don't have this infinite regress. You get back to an initial like moment. You could say there's a first moment of time, but it doesn't begin to exist because it's not preceded by non-existence.
So
I know that's a
then
lot to
does
take in.
that mean that you would say that God is the initial moment?
Not is the initial moment because God is time and time is the source of moments. So this is what's really hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, and it's something that I even still like keep reminding myself like this is super important. So this absolute theory says there's time and then there's moments of time. And so time itself is the source of these moments. And most of the stuff that we talk about in philosophy of time, in theology, and in physics, it's not talking about time. It's talking about properties or features of the timeline. It's talking about features of the series of moments. So it's very easy for us to get these two things confused. So a moment of time is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. And so God just hanging out by himself, that's the way things are. Because you're like, right, I've given you the description, like there's God, nothing else. And God could be subsequently otherwise because God has free will, he's got omnipotence, so he could be like, I'll do something if I want. So it's not that God is the moment, God's the source of the moment. By simply existing, and then he's the source of any subsequent moment by performing a free action.
So getting into the subject that surrounds theology most often, is it possible for God to create outside of time or without there being any sequence of moments?
I want to say no, and it's controversial, which it's fine. So let's define some of the terms so we can see why we can't just keep saying like, yeah, sure, why not? He's just outside of time. End of story, because it's not. So to be timeless is not simply to be eternal, because to be eternal was, remember, to exist without beginning and without end. If you want to say God's timeless, you have to add some additional claims. you have to say God exists without succession. So he doesn't do one thing and then another. And in fact, it's impossible for God to do one thing and then another. Further, you have to say God cannot stand in any sort of temporal relationships. God cannot be located at any moment, because if he exists right now, he's not doing a very good job at being timeless. If he existed in the past, you're not doing a great job at being timeless, and so on. And God cannot stand any sort of temporal relationships of any sort. So he can't be earlier than or later than. He cannot be simultaneous with, because those are all temporal relationships. So this is the idea. So you've got God somehow existing all at once without a before and after. And then you're like, okay, cool. So you've got God all alone, no universe. And then you've got God plus a universe. But somehow there's no change, there's no succession in God's life. And that should be enough to make you at least scratch your head and go, how does that work? Because, and to really let you know, like today, it's very easy to see a lot of theologians just very flippantly say, yeah, well, he's outside of time. What do you want? In the past, people have actually been bothered by this question a lot. So I think sometimes because we see the answers repeated, we forget how much it really bothered people in the past. So one of the questions that bothered people in the past was they had to figure out, when I talk about creation out of nothing, I have to describe God all alone and then describe God with a bunch of stuff. How do I talk about God prior to creation? And then how do I describe the God and then God plus? So like I've got the and then, which sounds like a new moment, and I've got prior, which sounds like earlier. How do I talk about that without introducing time? And the answer is, I've never seen a coherent explanation. People will go, well, just trust me. It works out. And I'm like, I can't just trust you because I pointed out the problem. Others will go, well, it's a pre-temporal before where God existed, and like so God existed before creation, and it's a pre-temporal before. Well, pre just means before. So you've just said it's a before, and trust me, it's not temporal. And I'm like, that doesn't. I'm sorry, that's incoherent. I've been in Scotland for too long. It's the birthplace of like common sense philosophy, and so I'm just like, if that's common sense, then I want to know what nonsense is. Like this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so that's also undergoing the assumption that God creates time, right? And so a
Correct.
lot of people
Yes.
have this idea that time is something that God creates. And so therefore,
Mhm.
if God only creates time later, then he can do all of these other sorts of things outside of time or prior to creating time, because time doesn't exist. So,
Mhm.
for example, the angels. Some people have postulated that God created the angels prior to time, or
Mhm.
that he's created them somehow in this empty time of some sort. But yeah, like how can we make sense of that? I mean, personally, yeah, that's my struggle, is like that just doesn't make sense to me. I just don't feel like it's reasonable. So like, is there any world that this makes sense in which God can create all of these things, including even our own world, outside of time?
The main strategy I see people do is they refuse to tell you what time is, and then they'll use a lot of spatial metaphors. So you'll say God's outside of time, and you've already used a spatial metaphor, because I'm like, is time like a box that he's like outside of? Is it like a building or something? Like a pool that you jump in and out of? Like what are you talking about? Those are all like material spatial things. If you're going to talk about time, don't give me the spatial metaphor, because that just causes confusion. Uh, and so what they'll do is they'll say, okay, I'm not going to define what time is. I know exactly what it is unless you ask me. That's what Augustine does, which is pretty funny. And because Augustine, he's got a lot of jokes. He's a good rhetorician. But then, yeah, so you don't define what time is. And then you're like, well, it's created, so he has to be outside of it. And I'm like, what's this spatial metaphor capturing onto? That's why I prefer to just go, let's get rid of the spatial metaphors and let's really state very clearly what it means to be timeless, just like I did a minute ago, and then go, okay, now we've got creating. What does it mean to create? If you affirm creation out of nothing, it's God all alone, and then God with some stuff. Now, what are you going to do? And so then that's where you get all these suggestions of like, well, it's a pre-temporal before, or it's a logical before, or it's a and it's just grasping at straws. So I think that's a very serious problem. there's been a move since Einstein, and this is a more popular move today, to say, well, what if we really spatialize time, and we affirm this view called eternalism, which says that all moments of the timeline are equally real. So we're located in the year 2024. Well, the year 2525 is just as real as this moment. And you're like, whoa, okay. And the past, all those past things, like those are just as real. And so what you get on this picture is God never exists without the created universe. You've just got from all eternity, God and this whole concrete timeline. It's all just there from all eternity. What you get from this view, if you affirm it, it solves at least one problem. And the problem it solves is, well, if creation ex nihilo is true, you've got God all alone and then God with all this stuff. And this view is saying God's never alone. It's just God with all this stuff. So you get out of that problem. There's other problems you get real fast, but you at least get out of that problem. I'll just pause there and see what you're thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious what you think of this objection. So this has been me and my brother's objection to this idea. And it's been this: if that is true, then it seems to me like God ultimately suffers an eternal hell in some way. Because if Christ is crucified on the cross, but all moments are equally real, then God never actually escapes this moment. And so, in essence, God suffers eternally in this endless moment because it's equally real for eternity. And so ultimately, God is the one who ultimately suffers hell. And that to me seems like a huge theological problem because it's never finished. You know, when Jesus says
Mhm.
it is finished, in reality, it's never finished. It's
Exactly.
going on for forever. So I find this to be a big problem. It struggles. And so I was wondering, yeah, if you could help articulate. So in your view, talking about this absolute theory, how does that work or explain with the difference between like an A theory and a B theory of time? So the difference between like presentism or like, yeah, this idea that everything is just one giant block in a sense.
Mhm. So the absolute theory of time is theoretically consistent with both an A theory and a B theory. So it could be consistent with presentism, where only the present moment exists, or it could be consistent with an eternalist view, where all the moments exist. So that's not the issue that'll really help get out of the exact problem you've laid out. With the absolute theory, at least, if you affirm presentism, you get out of the problem that you've laid out. But then you get all these other problems, though, of like, so God existed all alone, and then with the universe, God was not incarnate, and then became incarnate. Well, okay, now we've got all the problems for timelessness, which is fine with me because I'm like, just get rid of it. But if someone is looking at the objection you just laid out, and they're going, okay, well, I affirm this eternalist view, ontology of time, in order to affirm that God is timeless, and now you're like, oh gosh, uh, now it looks like God's eternally suffering. That's pretty terrible. Nobody wants that. How do we get out of it? Well, you've got a few different options. If you affirm that God is timeless, you might also affirm that God is impassible, which means that God cannot possibly be moved or influenced by anything outside of himself for his beliefs or his emotions or his actions. So it's just impossible for God to suffer. And then you're probably going to go, but on the cross, he's suffering. They're like, oh, only in his human nature, only in his human nature. God the Son, who is identical to the divine nature on this view, he doesn't suffer, but his human nature does. And you're like, well, isn't that just Nestorianism? To which I want to go, yeah, I've got a couple of papers and book chapters arguing that this just is Nestorianism through and through. But that's the move, at least, is to try to get out of the objection you laid out, is to try to look at some other attributes to see if they help you out.
See, that's the thing is that, you know what? So probably 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, I would have been your biggest fan. Not that I don't like you now, but like when I was much younger,
Sure.
I was really, really into theology proper. Right. And so I'm
Hmm.
reading Stephen Charnock, I'm reading, all these books. And yeah, I just kind of grew up with a lot of the assumptions of classical theism and, had heard all these
Hmm.
notions. And then, yeah, started reading into them more and more. And I was running into these problems, which just didn't make sense to me. And no matter what I read, to me, they're just kind of like asserting a lot of these things and they would say it but then like the rationales behind them were never really that strong or compelling in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so today I'm much more interested in biblical theology. I've got some other projects that I'm working on, but for these very problems, I very much am still curious about like, okay, wait. What is the real answers to getting around these? Because to me, there really are good
Mhm.
answers. Like the problem I had growing up was that I would come and ask a pastor, hey, like, how does this work? And obviously, for many of these types of questions, they weren't exactly eager to help too much because they had no idea what to say. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I often found that
Yeah.
there
No, I think
were
that's fair.
good
Yeah.
answers, but you kind of had to do your own homework. And so I am
Yeah.
wondering, like, yeah, that's why we're here. How do you help
Exactly.
solve these issues of like, where do we go? Like, should we be hedging towards one direction or the other? Because as you pointed out, like, okay, saying that God is, time or that it's an attribute. And actually, I do want to know, like, do you state it one way or the other that God is time or that it's an attribute of God?
So you can say it either way because when you make statements like God is, uh, you could either have that as an identity claim or a predication. Like God is omnipotent. Um, God has power. Those I feel like that those could mean the same thing if you take the is to
Mhm.
be predication. And so I'm quite happy to say that with time. So like God is time. Time is an essential attribute of God uh, because I'm using the is of predication. If you there are some people in history, so there's this guy named Nicole Orsamy who's a classical theist, and so he affirms divine simplicity. So all the predications you make of God, they have to be identity statements. So when he says like space and time are divine attributes, has to be like God is identical to time, God is identical to space. So there are examples of people who will do that. I don't like simplicity, so I'm like, it's just like a predication. God is love, God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, God is time. And you're like, it sounds weird at first, but then you start putting it in other, you're like, well, actually, we talk this way all the time. So maybe it's not that weird.
Well, and exactly on that notion, thinking about the idea that God is time, it seemed to be something that I've never read. Like I said, I used to love the subject, but I'd never read any of the
Mhm.
other theologians express it that way. I mean, even the classical
Yeah.
theists and those who believed in simplicity, they never really put time in that equation. I mean, they do
Yeah.
assume it
So
because,
I
of
didn't,
course, all of the properties,
yeah.
are in God. But
Yeah, it's a view that hasn't really been explored that much. So so when I was doing my PhD, so Catherine Holly, she was in the philosophy department, and I would have some meetings with her every now and then just to make sure, like, am I getting my philosophy of time straight? And she was an atheist, so I didn't want to talk about God stuff with her. I was like, let's just talk about the philosophy of time. But she was so curious, so fascinated about God, and she kept asking me, "Where does God fit into this?" And I was like, "Well, I'm not there yet, like, or I didn't want to talk about it with her at first." And then she's like, if you took this absolute theory and you said God is time, that would be a really cool argument for the existence of God." And so this was like 2011, and I just looked at her and I was like, "I don't know, that sounds really crazy," and it just was like, "I'm not doing that." Then later on, much later on, like I'm thinking about these issues a lot more, trying to work on the second book. And I noticed I'd seen some of these kind of claims about God is time, but then I saw all these philosophers of science try to dismiss it, go, that's not really what any of these people meant because God, ew. It was kind of the attitude. And then Emily Thomas, who's at the University of Durham, she's a historian she does a lot of early modern philosophy. She's looks a lot at the history of philosophy of time. And she wrote this really great book called Absolute Time, Rifts in Modern Philosophy. And she articulates the view and argues it so well of going, yeah, these people literally thought that space and time were divine attributes. And so I decided to investigate the issue further. And so what you'll see me do in the Divine Time Maker book is I call this the identification view, and I try to trace out some of the history of it as best as I can. I don't know how early the view is. I can find it in a lot of ancient and medieval Hindu texts. I can find it in some medieval and early modern Christian texts, there's some places in some different Islamic thinkers where it looks like they might be affirming this view, but I don't know. So there's a lot of work to be done to really try to trace it out. So basically what I've been trying to do is go, here's this view. There's some historical precedent for it. Let's develop it. Now, maybe now that we know what we're looking for, maybe we can start seeing it in a whole lot of other thinkers in the past. Because we might have just been missing it because we didn't know what to look for, because we were so caught up in just kind of receiving these standard classical categories and just dismissing everything in the sort of ways that you're talking about. We're like, oh, God's timeless into story.
So, which way does this hedge us concerning presentism or eternalism for the rest of our experience?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, should we
For
be
me,
going towards one way?
I think you should go towards presentism. So it's a view that, like, in the Western world, I can't find anybody denying it until Einstein. Like, kind of like just a little bit before Einstein, you find some people start questioning it. Emily Thomas says, like, it was just presentism was just, you don't see people debating it, even debating it. Like, there's just, it's taken for granted until you get to kind of like just prior to Einstein. Whereas I found some medieval Buddhists who actually debated presentism versus eternalism. So I know there's people before Einstein that did debate it, but I can't find it in the Western world. So I think it's a very intuitive view, and it's typically said to be the most common sense view. And I'm like, sounds good. Sometimes it's said to be anti-scientific, but that's just because they're basing their ideas on science from the 1920s. And what year is it? Is it 1920? No, it's not. Things have moved on significantly since then. So I'm just not worried if my view conflicts with outdated physics. I think that eternalism, or the B theory, I think it brings a lot of problems in our theology. And that's one of the things I've tried to do a lot of work on with the Divine Time Maker book, is to lay that out in a lot of detail, because it's not really been done. So some of the problems that you pointed out earlier, where it's like, well, Jesus is just suffering on the cross forever. Like, it's never finished. It's just eternally he's on the cross. And I'm like, yeah, that's one problem. Think about all the horrible things that have happened throughout history. Just add them up.
Yeah.
They never cease to exist. They are co-eternal with God. And I'm like, so when Revelation tells me there's going to be this day that'll come when there's no more sin, no more sickness, no more death, no more tears. And I'm like, well, tell that to all the people who are literally located at those other moments of time that are eternally suffering. That doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
So you can just start adding up a lot of problems like this.
Interesting. Yeah. So I am also wondering, like, how does this actually affect a practical paradigm? So let me give you like one example. How does this work with the twin paradox? I know this may not be like in the same realm quite, but if God is the source of time, or he is time, then why is it that some people experience time differently than others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the twin paradox. So when you're looking at a lot of these paradoxes in physics, there's an underlying assumption that you need to really make explicit. And so there's this history of what's called verificationism. You don't really need to worry about that. Here's the important part. There's an assumption in a lot of physics that we just take time to be clocks. We take space to be like measuring rods, and that's it. So we're not really interested in like that. Like when I told you when I went to the Higgs Center for Theoretical Physics, I was like, what is time? They're like, we don't know. We'll just say, like, here's a clock, here's this measurement system. That's all we care about. And so if you put a clock on someone and then they start going around different gravitational, like gravity's going to affect the clock. It's going to, and we see this too. Like if you're in a really tall building, the clocks at the top run at a different rate than the clocks at the bottom, because gravity affects clocks. When I lived in Finland, I was on the 13th floor of this building. And so my clock was not on the same, was constantly like, I have to adjust it to make it synchronize with the clocks at the bottom. Was I like literally in some like different, like, was I in the future or the past or something compared to the people down? No, that's nuts. Same thing with the twin paradox. Be like, so you strapped a clock to this guy and he went somewhere, and then gravity affected the clock that's next to him. Okay. Now the experience question, though, this is interesting, because we've been corrupted by a lot of science fiction. I love science fiction. It's totally fun. There's a lot of fun. All the time travel stories, crazy stuff. It's fun. But we've been corrupted by this to think that maybe time is like that. And the only reason you don't think it is because, you're just like this like myopic sort of like, no, 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 no. Yeah. When I'm on a plane and you're on a plane next to me, we arrive at the destination at the same time. My experience though is I hate flying. I have to fly all the time. But oh gosh, every tiny little, even the suggestion of turbulence. The last flight I went on, they're like about 3 hours in, it's going to be some mild to moderate turbulence. So prepare you. And I'm like, I'm already freaking out. And so that like 6 hour flight feels like an eternity. Whereas for like some of the people around me, they're just like, oh, that went by so fast. Oh, I got to watch a movie. That was nice. And I'm like, white knuckles, like, gripping on this thing. Your experience of time depends on a lot of different features of like your life, what you think is important, what you're kind of going through. But that doesn't mean that we're all in like some different like timeline or like times weird wibbly wobbly stuff. Like it's just your experiences are different. That's it.
Interesting. Is it possible for there to even be other timelines?
I want to say no, because there's this one thesis that people have kind of ignored lately for some reason. I think it's because we've been corrupted by a lot of science fiction. So a very common view in the past was that time is essentially and necessarily unified. So so it would just say like time is ubiquitous across reality. So it's not like you could just start walking around the universe and all of a sudden like find yourself in another timeline. Like that is not how things work, because it would have gone from one point to the next, from one moment to the next. So it would have to be connected. So there couldn't be different timelines. The idea of different timelines was just taken to be incoherent from the start because time is necessarily unified. If you take God out of the picture and you go with this eternalist ontology of time, so you fully spatialize time, you could start talking about different timelines being completely separated. Things get weird, but that's because you are having to talk about time in very, very spatial terms. So you could talk about time, different timelines if you wanted to, or different like multiverse kind of stuff, like Rick and Morty sort of stuff if you want. But you've got to really spatialize time and stop thinking about time in really temporal terms.
Okay, but you have told me that we shouldn't spatialize time. So in that
Yes.
case, we actually shouldn't think about a timeline, right? So how should we actually think about time? Should we actually think of a line going and we're just in this particular moment? Or instead, is there a different way that we should be thinking about time?
Yeah. So I actually, this is a really good question. It bothers me a lot. I've got a section on it in the Divine Time Maker book, where I don't ask it in relationship to the timeline. I ask it in relation to the question about, does time have a direction? Is typically how it goes.
Yeah.
So usually when we say there's time's linear, we're saying it has a direction. It goes that way. And you're like, okay. And then we draw, a line on paper and put an arrow on it. And so people go, well, why does time go in that direction? Because why can't it go backwards? And I'm like, oh gosh, this whole idea of a direction, that's just a spatial term. So if I say, can I go this direction or that direction in time? It sounds like I'm asking an intelligible question. Whereas if I get rid of all the spatial stuff and make it purely like temporal, I'm asking, well, could I be previously, subsequently, otherwise? Like at the next moment, could I go back in time is what I'm asking. Like, can I be previously, subsequently, otherwise? And they're like, Ryan, did you have a stroke? That's an unintelligible question. And I'm like, right. When you get rid of the spatial stuff and you start putting it just purely temporal terms, the absurdity is just right there on its face. And I'm like, that's what we should be doing,
So then if I shouldn't think about it on a timeline, like, mm, I guess I would say like, why shouldn't I? What makes it not spatial? I mean, because we think about it in spatial terms, and you talked about a little bit like the idea of relational sense. So is it just how we relate to God as opposed to some sort of spatial metaphor?
Yeah, I mean, God exists right now, and he's kind of he's the source of right now, and I exist right now. So that's it's not my only relationship to God, because there's also like love and all that, going on too. But like that's at least one relationship that I have with God. If you think God is also space, uh, which there are people who think that, I don't know what to say about that yet. If you say that, then what you could do is say, a lot of this stuff where I start bringing in all the spatial metaphors to talk about my relationship with God. Well, that's okay, because God is also like space is also an essential attribute of God. So I just need to kind of clarify a little bit of what I'm up to. Am I really talking about time at the moment, or am I really talking about space stuff at the moment? So that's a thing, that a project that I think actually probably be really good to do, is to try to figure out how to just cleanse all of our language, get rid of some of these unhelpful metaphors. But that's really hard, because we talk metaphorically all the time. Like, we just can't help it. So I would like to get rid of it to some extent, but then my language would get boring really fast.
I don't think that would be the problem, because I mean, like most of us have understood from listening to you, is that it's the clear language that has made your conversation so interesting. It's not the obscurity of it that's made it interesting. It's the clarity. It's everyone else. It's really the response to all of the nonsense that has made your stuff so interesting to listen to. Now, concerning space, though, I've heard you talk about omnipresence. Now, personally, I actually think that omnipresence should be stricken actually from God, to put my cards on the table. But I am curious what
Okay.
you think about that relation. Yeah, like why do you think omnipresence is important for some reason? Um,
It depends. So there's these different debates. So I don't think omnipresence is essential to God, because if God doesn't create anything at all, what is he present to? Like, he's not present to any.
mhm,
You could be like, well, he's present to himself, and I'm like, that's not what we mean by omnipresence. Come on. What we mean by omnipresence is that for any like object that exists other than God, any other uh, distinct object that exists, God is aware of its existence, so he knows it exists, and
mhm.
he is causally sustaining it in existence. So he's present in terms of his knowledge and his power. And so there's a lot of people who say that's all we mean by omnipresence, and that's typically how I see it. As like, that's just what we mean by omnipresence. Whereas there are other people, they want to go further. They want to say like there's some like more stronger special sense in which God's like present. It could be that like, well, God's substance is there, and I'm like, yeah, tell me what that means beyond what I've already said, and I've never gotten clear on what that means beyond what I've said. The really interesting one is where you go, well, God is space. And you're like, whoa, what is that? And you're like, okay. Well, the relational theory of space says space is just a relationship between physical objects. So if you don't have multiple physical objects, you don't have space. The absolute theory says there's just all the possible spatial locations, and there's a substance that undergirds all of those possible spatial locations. And so what you would be saying is God just is that substance that undergirds all those spatial locations. And so we are literally located in God. I don't know what to do with that
Yeah,
theory yet.
yeah, that's the part that sounds a little strange and stuff. So with your first example that you gave,
Yeah.
that's pretty much one of the reasons why I just think that omnipresence is not a helpful term, because it seems to me like if God is omniscient and he's omnipotent, what else is there? What am I adding to the table when I say he's
Yeah.
omnipresent? And then to me,
Yeah.
it brings in confusion, because the average layperson, in my opinion, they think of God as basically like pantheistic. God is in the
Mm.
universe, kind of like what you're articulating there for a minute. And so I feel like it's either confusing, redundant, or yeah, just unnecessary. And so that's kind of
Hmm.
why I lean away from it. And secondly, I don't really feel like there's an abundance of scriptural examples for it. And so it's like, well, I don't really feel like I lose anything if I say, oh, God's not omnipresent. And it's like, but he is omnipotent and
Yeah.
omniscient. I'm like, okay.
Yeah. The only thing the problem you'll face is people going, what do you mean? And then you have to explain, well, he's causally sustaining everything, and he knows everything. So all you're doing is just laying out what people have always meant by omnipresent. But since people don't know those definitions, yeah, they're going to look at you going, Adam, what are you, you're crazy, So yeah, that's the problem you'll face, is you have to go, okay, let me explain it really quick.
Well, I've gotten used to being controversial at this point, so I'm not gonna I'm not gonna let that stop me now. Uh, so, what is the greatest obstacle to kind of become overcome at this point in understanding God's relation to time or our relation to God and time? Because this is a really, really
Mhm.
complicated subject for most. And for most, honestly, I feel like most theologians have actually thought that this is just a uh, inexpressible topic that it's almost beyond our ability to even explain.
Yeah. You see that a lot. You'll see that kind of attitude in a lot of different areas of theology where they're like, "It's just beyond our ability to express this." And I'm like, "We didn't try very hard, did you?" Uh, so if you tried a little bit harder, you know, I would get this when I was in seminary too. I would hear this kind of statement of like, "Well, can you preach that?" And I'm like, "I could preach that. Can you? Like just because you lack the ability to preach on this topic, don't come to me." Or like when somebody blames the Holy Spirit on their lack of preparing or something. So I've got this brand new book out. This is called Eternal in Love, a little book about a big God. And this is short, popular level book. And it's devotional. It's also very sarcastic, which I don't normally get to do. And it's actually affordable, unlike all the academic books. This is not $100. You can actually buy it. So I've got this chapter on the eternal God without creation. And one of the things I lay out is some of the problems we've talked about of going, so God exists before creation, but like it's not temporal. That sounds confusing. And I'm like, yeah, if you stop talking in these confusing terms, theology just gets better and easy to understand. It doesn't have to be like, get rid of man-made problems. One of the other things I talk about when with the time stuff, I point out that there's a lot of stuff that we kind of conflate when we talk about time in theology. One of the things we're usually interested in is the significance of different historical moments. That's usually one of the things we're really interested in when we're talking about time. Um, and so we kind of conflate like a lot of different things, and that's one of them. And I get it because that's more interesting. Like why did this particular moment happen? What was the significance of that? Like when Jesus like entered into like the temple and proclaimed these various things. What was going on there? Everyone, like, these are big moments, and that's the stuff we really get interested in. Whereas you go, well, there's just like these moments, and then they're just a way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. Like that sounds really boring. And so what I try to lay out is, yeah, some of these topics are really boring, and that's why people don't even bother to think about it. But I'll lay it out clearly for you, so think about it clearly. And now we can get on to the thing that you're really interested in, which is like, why are these particular moments happening? Like, what's going on with the significance of this stuff?
Yeah. Why why hasn't anyone done this before?
I think it's because we go back to that earlier question, like St. Augustine's question, what is time? I know what it is unless you ask me. And and since no one like will answer that question, then you can just start saying anything and everything and nothing. When you don't define your terms, like, you're unconstrained and you're allowed to talk nonsense, and you don't realize you're talking nonsense because you never defined it. So when we finally get a clear definition, then you can start going, oh gosh, clear definitions, they have implications. Now I can start thinking through some of these implications. And so what I've tried to do in this little book about a big God, and then what I've tried to do in this next book, Divine Time Maker, is to look at what are some of these implications. And I can guarantee you I have not figured out all of the implications. Like, I'll need everybody else's help to spot more things. But just trying to lay the groundwork of going, here's a clear definition. Whew. Okay, now what? Let me kind of help you get started, and then hopefully everybody else can run with it.
Now, I want to connect this a little bit, and even though we won't at all have time to develop this entirely, but
Mhm.
concerning the idea of divine providence and all those other things, basically, why aren't you an open theist? Now, here's one of the arguments that I've heard. The argument goes like this: if there's an infinite number of sequential moments into the future, and an infinite number is theoretically impossible to know since it's ongoing, it's eternal, it's eternal in the sense that it's continuously going, and God could not know that hypothetically, then isn't it reasonable, some would say, that
Mhm.
there has to be some things that are outside or beyond God's knowledge?
There's two assumptions in there that I think you might want to that one could question. The first one is that the future is infinite. Is it an actual infinite or is it a potential infinite? I want to say it's a potential infinite, because it keeps going and going and going. You can't reach an actual infinite through successive addition. So if I dare you to count to infinity right now, and then you're like one, two, you're never going to get there. So same thing with the future. It's not going to reach an actual infinite. The second assumption that seems to be at play in this argument is that God cannot know the infinite. And I don't know why that should be the case. Historically, when you're looking at infinity, it is a mess. It is an absolute mess. Oh my goodness. You've got so many different definitions. There are people who, like, this is quite early on in the Western world, will say infinity just means chaotic, incomplete, unknowable. So God cannot be infinite because God is not chaotic. He's like, maybe you and I can't know God, but he at least knows himself. And God's not incomplete. So, but then like later on, you'll see people try to develop like more like different kind of definitions of infinity. Um, and they'll say like, yeah, God does know all that infinite stuff. So I'd want to know which view of infinity we've got in mind and why that entails that God could not know it.
Hmm. Well, I was wondering also about your thoughts on God's knowledge, since some people actually postulate
Mhm,
that the reason that he knows all things is because he is outside of time and that all moments are equally real.
mhm,
Therefore, that's how he knows. But do we have to postulate that? Or is it some other method? Is there some, how does God know everything? Since you're not postulating a B theory where everything is just one giant block. So if that's not the
mhm,
case and presentism, let's just for the moment say that presentism is true, so only this moment is actually real, then how can God know everything?
mhm. So I've got a chapter on that, and it's based on an earlier paper that people can get for free online, called "Divine Temporality and Providential Bodgery." Bodgery is this delightful English word that my friend TJ Mawson at Oxford uses. So you bodge something up if you intend to bring about some particular outcome, and then you just fail to bring it about. So one of the examples Tim will give is, uh, I would like to make a baked Alaska, like to cook a baked Alaska. It's very difficult to do, and so you try it, and then oof, you didn't get a baked Alaska in the end. We bodged it. You really bodged it. And so Tim says, well, if God's temporal, then God wouldn't know the future, and so he'd really bodge things up. He could really like screw up history, like providence, just complete failure. And so what I do in response is I go, Is God's relationship to time, is that the thing that's actually doing all the work here? No, not at all. And so what I do is I look at the actual claims of all these different views. So historically, the people who would say God's timeless, they would also say that God's knowledge is not dependent upon what happens in time. Because God's impassible, can't be influenced by anything outside of himself. So, what's doing the work there is the claim that God knows everything because he knows his own essence. And I'm like, okay, if that's how God gets the knowledge, him being timeless has nothing to do with it. So if God's temporal, you could say, yeah, God knows everything because he knows his own essence. Okay, next. And you're like, well, the B theory, like you brought up, you're like, okay, maybe God actually looks at the whole block. And I'm like, you don't need to be timeless to look at the whole block. Okay. So timelessness is doing nothing. Next. And then you look at like Molinism or Calvinism. Calvinism is a great example, because God knows the future because he causally determines everything that's going to happen. And I'm like, well, you definitely don't need timelessness for that. So I just kind of go one by one by each point out each case, like all these theological views, everyone just goes, oh, timelessness is doing the work. I'm like, timelessness is literally doing nothing. It's just a word you throw around. What's doing the actual work is something else in your doctrine of God or your doctrine of providence or your doctrine of creation. That's what's doing the work. And the temporalist can just be like, yeah, that's fine. That's what's doing the work for me.
So I want to get a little bit of your help because I have an upcoming debate, and the person that I'm debating, he holds to another view of time, and he actually wants to posit backwards causation. That's one of his saving graces to save his
Okay.
position. So what do you think about that, Dr. Mullins?
That's just I'm sorry. Like if we want to talk about reality, then we just should just go no. I'm sorry, but just no. Like because backwards causation, like gosh, in order to make it work, you need a lot of crazy stuff. One of the things you need, I don't even know where to begin actually. One of the things you need to make it coherent without changing the past is you need causal loops. So you get like this circular, like I caused it and then I caught. Here'd be like a loop. So if time is circular, I'm born and then I die and then I'm born. And so there's a sense in which my death is before my birth. And then there's a sense in which my birth is before my birth. And you're like, that's just nuts. Like, and you're like, oh, but I gave like a circle. I can explain the circle. You're like, this is nuts. We're not talking about reality. You have to do the similar kind of stuff with causal loops, where you have to talk about how something was able to cause stuff that it already needed to be there in order to bring about the later moment that causes the stuff in the back. And causal loops also, there's no explanation for how they get there, so they violate any version of the principle of sufficient reason. So that's pretty bad. And then also in order to make sense of causal loops, a lot of people think you need hyper time to explain it, because you can ask the question, when is this causal loop taking place? You can't say it's taking place right now, because it's taking place at a series of moments. And so, well, you can say it's happening hyper now. So you have to add in an additional timeline by this hyper time on which all this crazy causal loop stuff is happening. And that gets really complicated. And if that's what you have to do to defend your view of theology, you could do that. I don't know. You're not putting forward anything that's plausible. And a lot of people really hate hypertime. Even people who defend hypertime, they're like, yeah, it's crazy. I don't actually like it. So I don't know. But that's what you have to do just to have backwards causation. And I don't think I explained it
So
very well
two,
because it's crazy.
well, that is the way that I tend to think of it. I just find this to be, well, I just think that it just doesn't survive Occam's razor. It's just like, these are all these additional entities, postulations that just seem completely unnecessary. And that certainly one of these other solutions are significantly simpler and can solve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So adding in backwards causation to save your position to me is virtually ad hoc. Like it's just like you're trying really, really, really hard to save your position.
Yeah.
But yeah.
That's
so two other
one of them.
very,
Yeah. I was going to say that's the main
so,
objection to a lot of the simple foreknowledge views is to go, you have to add in causal loops to save the view. Like this is not simple anymore. Like, yeah. So anyway, go on to the next question. Yeah.
yeah. So why have you ruined my childhood? See, and we all really want to know, is Back to the Future just crap? All of us have believed so long, man.
I mean, here's the thing. When you're reading any fictional story, you have to suspend your imagination. And one of the things that makes a really good story is where you don't feel like you're really suspending your imagination that much. So that's what I like about like Back to the Future. The whole trilogy is like, you have to suspend your imagination a bit, obviously, but you don't really feel like you're doing it. Whereas like some other movies where it's like really bad time travel story, like it feels very forced and like you run into all these paradoxes and all these contradictions, and you're just like, I can't suspend my judgment anymore. Like this is just, I don't know what we're doing anymore. So Back to the Future, I want to say like good movie because you don't really feel like you're suspending your judgment that much, your imagination that much.
Okay, so if killer machines took over the Earth, could the leader of the resistance send someone back in time ultimately to save mankind?
If presentism is true, the answer is no, because there's no past to go back to. And then if eternalism is true, there's a sense in which you're not actually sending anyone back, because you would just have the part of John Connor that's just always been located at those past moments, and then the parts of John Connor that are supposedly entering into, well, actually, it's the Terminator, right? Because John Connor doesn't actually go back, does he? In any of the movies?
No.
No, it's just Terminator. Yeah, it's just the Terminator. Yeah, so you just have the temporal parts of Arnold stepping into the time machine, and other temporal parts of him just located at these earlier moments. So not really anybody's actually traveling.
Is it a logical contradiction to say that somebody could change a moment in the past? Like, is that even something that's possible for God, or is it simply a contradiction?
So Robin Le Pedevin, in his introduction to philosophy of time and space, it's called Travels in Four Dimension. Uh, I think it's so readable, it's so accessible, and he argues yes, because what you have is it was the case that X, and then if you change it, then it was the case that not X. And so you've got X and not X, and you're like, oh gosh. And that's where the crazy hypertime stuff comes in to try to help. So Nick Effingham has this book on the philosophy of time travel, and so what he points out is you have to do, in order to avoid these kind of contradictions, you have to add in like some hypertime kind of stuff, and things get weird really fast to avoid these kind of contradictions.
But can we still enjoy Avengers Endgame because it's not doing the same thing?
Maybe. You can enjoy it for lots of reasons. One of which is part of it's filmed in Edinburgh, Scotland, and so there's a bunch of spots where I'm like, oh, that's where they filmed it, and oh, that was the reason I couldn't get home that one day because I was trying to walk and you guys blocked everything to like film, and I'm like, oh, gosh, so I had to like walk 20 minutes around, to get that happened. It was annoying, but I still like the movie. Another reason you might like it is to go. Some of these Marvel movies are painfully dull and like boring, and so finally, like, get the culmination of like that in a good movie. You're like, okay, can we be done with this now? So those are reasons you could like the movie, apart from all the, do they avoid time travel nonsense?
So could you have parallel timelines theoretically?
If you want to spatialize time like we talked about earlier, um, I want to say no. And so here's the idea. So if God is time itself, one of the things that, if you're looking at two different moments, you can ask, do they both exist now? And if you've got two genuinely parallel timelines, you would have to say no, they both don't exist now, because this other one is completely unrelated, so it doesn't exist right now. If it exists right now, well, then it's just not a separate timeline. It's just now. It's the same moment. Now, if God exists and God's temporal and God's causally sustaining all these different timelines, you could ask, well, when do they exist? And be like, well, they all exist in God's now, and God's now is just is the now. So they're not really separate anymore.
Then could you have parallel universes on the same timeline?
So this is what Richard Swinburne wants to do. So Swinburne will say time is essentially and necessarily unified, so you can't have these different timelines. But if you don't think that space is absolute, you could talk about there being different spatial dimensions where it's impossible, because they're different spatial dimensions. You cannot travel from one to the other. Like, you couldn't get in a rocket ship and go from one to the other. Because they're not connected in any meaningful way. If you could travel from one location to the other, then they're spatially contiguous, which means they're all in the same unified space. So if you're going to have really genuinely separate spaces, like spatial, like universes, then you can't travel from one to the other physically. So what Swinburne says is, maybe this is the way you could think about heaven. Heaven is another spatial location that is not spatially contiguous with our universe. So you can't physically travel from one to the next. But God could take a soul from our universe and place it and connect it to a body in the other universe. So the soul could travel, because the soul's not a spatial. On Swinburne, at least his earlier work, the soul's doesn't have like a clear spatial location. So like at death, soul goes to be in another spatial location that's not spatially contiguous with ours. So it's a separate space altogether. Since I don't know what space is exactly, I've not made up my mind. I can't say for certain that's wrong, because I don't know. I don't know.
So could you stop time but still have motion or events taking place? Or
No.
are
Yeah, go
are
ahead.
events, yeah. Yeah, oh, I think you're about to explain, but in essence, yeah. is the sequence of moments need time? Must there be time for a sequence of moments or action motion to take place?
Yeah, so this is where I disagree with actually with a lot of the earlier proponents of the absolute theory of time. So there's all these different thought experiments you'll see where they'll say. So here's one of the questions. Like Hinduism actually, different versions of Hinduism actually think this, but in the scientific revolution, they would give this thought experiment of imagine God creates our universe, lets it go for a while, and then he destroys it, and he waits 1,000 years. Nothing's happening at all. It's just God hanging out by himself. 1,000 years go by, and then he creates another universe. And so the question is this: is it meaningful to say that 1,000 years went by, past, between the destruction of one universe and the creation of the next? Because nothing's happening at all. Nothing's taking place. So let me just ask to see what your intuitions are on that.
Well, now you've got my whole eschatological brain thinking, because you're using also the
Mm-hmm.
terminology of 1,000 years, which brings in all these other things. And
Sure.
I'm debating on some of those topics coming up. So, well, let me ask, I want to frame it in a particular way then, because I think that this analogy is really, really interesting, where you're talking about like, okay, yeah, let's imagine theoretically there's 1,000-year time where nothing is happening at all,
Mm-hmm.
right? I want to postulate this idea for a moment, right? Let's imagine that soul sleep are true, right? Let's imagine there's no heaven view. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
you die and your body goes into the grave, but it's completely unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there's no conscious, but let's assume, I don't know, whichever view you want to espouse to say that your soul still exists, substance dualism or something like that, but it's just asleep until the resurrection of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So for you, that whatever the soul is that's not alive, in essence, is it just one moment? Does it really undergo the thousands of years that everything else undergoes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with this one, I want to say, yeah, it does undergo all those thousands of years, because again, think about like a plane ride. If the doctor gives me medicine that knocks me out entirely, um, I'm out. No, just no, like no conscious thoughts at all, like really. And then I wake up, and then I discover that we haven't even taken off. We were just stuck on the tarmac for 3 hours. And so now I've wasted this pill that's going to help me get through this journey. My goodness, this is terrible. That actually happened. So yeah, like I'm unconscious throughout that whole time. But that's the thing. It was the whole time. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it corresponded exactly with everybody else's time. Just our experiences were massively different because some people were conscious throughout all of it. I was not. And then you could say the same thing about soul sleep. Is a whole bunch of people are not conscious throughout all of that. God is conscious throughout all that. If there's angels, yeah, they're conscious throughout all of that. If anybody's alive when Christ returns, well, yeah, they're conscious. I'm not though, because I'm just unconscious. I'm just out, and then they wake me up. So it feels like a moment has passed, and we all know that experience. We've all had that experience. You wake up and you're like, oh gosh, what day is it? I'm late for school. Oh wait, I'm an adult. I'm not in school anymore. We've had these experiences, and so that's the soul sleep view. As far as I can tell, is like it feels like a moment, but it's not really been a single moment because the whole world has continued to change and move on.
So is that different with God though? If nothing else exists, if nothing else is going on, but only God is there, is time still going on? Or I don't really like, yeah, you've
Exactly.
broken me
Yeah,
at this
that's why I
point.
asked. Yeah, and because this is the absolute theory, historically has said moments continue to pass from moment to moment to moment to moment. That's why you can meaningfully say there's 1,000 years between the universes, even though God's not doing anything. Uh, and so the claim is, you'll see they'll say time exists without change. And so that this is supposed to give you kind of pump your intuitions in this favor of saying the 1,000 years in between, yeah, it's time continues to go on from moment to moment to moment, but there's no change taking place. But one of the things I do in the time maker book, just to really screw everybody's head up a little bit more, is to go, well, I'm sorry, you still have a change from moment to moment to moment. Like that's change. That's, you didn't give me time without change, my dear friend. Like you gave me a lot of changes. 1,000 years worth of changes. If God's truly doing nothing and nothing's happening at all, then that's a single moment, because a moment of time is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. If it's just God by himself not doing anything, that's the way things are. If God does something, then things become subsequently otherwise. So, as I see it, this thought experiment is a failure, because what you would have in between the universes is a single moment where God's not doing anything. And you can't say a single moment lasts for 1,000 years. And so what I end up doing is I give the absolute theory um, a real way of saying time exists without change. Um, but it looks very different than what historically absolute theorists have said. Now, how people respond to this, I have no idea, because this is something that I think I've only published on like one other place. So I haven't gotten people's reactions to this one a lot. So I don't know. I don't know how people are going to respond to this.
This is easily one of the most interesting thought experiments on the subject. I've never heard of this postulation before. Like, I mean, many of the other time paradoxes I've heard or thought about, but yeah, this. So you're saying that 1,000 years is real, but it's a single moment in time.
I want to say that
I'm
it's a single
struggling
moment, so it is not 1,000 years. So what the thought experiment was originally designed to do by the absolute theorist was to get you. There's a whole bunch of moments taking place. So it's time without change, and so it's literally 1,000 years. But what I'm pointing out is going, you still have a lot of change going on in the world, because you got moment to moment to moment. I think it's just a single moment, and so you could not meaningfully say it's 1,000 years. You could still say time exists, because you got a way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise, and God just is time. But there's no 1,000 years. So I'm in that sense, I'm kind of really going against what a lot of absolute theorists have said in the past. But this is a thought experiment that has really been lost to history. So I've just kind of resurrected it.
Yeah, that's a fascinating one.
Yeah.
You're going to ruin the rest of my week. That's all I'll be thinking about. Oh, so you would say though, so concerning like, let's say creation, the first act of creation must begin. I don't want to say time, because I don't know exactly how you would phrase that, but the first moment of creation, you have to have, I don't know actually what you would say, because if God is time, so you have time without a succession of moments, right?
Yep.
Then what would you say? Like it has to begin subsequent moments? If God first creates something.
Exactly. Yeah. So this goes back to what we talked about quite earlier in this conversation, is that question: what does it mean to begin to exist? It's when a thing begins when it's preceded by non-existence. So the act of creation, well, God wasn't creating at the initial moment. He's not doing anything at the initial moment, just like thinking his own thoughts. The triune persons just simply just enjoying each other. That's that. There's no. So the second moment, that's a moment that begins to exist. And so any sort of creative act that's going to correspond to a moment that begins to exist. That act of creating a universe begins to exist. Now, one of the questions you might be wondering, though, is, because you don't want to say time begins, but you might ask a different question of like, well, time as we know it, in terms of like being able to develop clocks and measurement systems, does that begin to exist? That's why the book is called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker, because the question is, does God create time, or does God create a clock? And I want to say God does not create time, because God is time. But when God creates a universe, one of the things he's doing is he's setting up all the conditions you need for a clock and for a measurement system. Because the stuff you need to be able to measure a series of moments is you need something that creates a consistent tick, a consistent change. And laws of nature do that. So I want to say when God creates a universe, he's not creating time, he's creating a clock. So he's a watchmaker, not a time maker.
That's a really interesting distinction as well. How would you say that this differs from, let's say, Dr. Craig's view? In Craig's view, does God create? He's the creator of time. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So, what's the distinction between these two if you're articulating the difference between Craig's view and your view?
Mhm. Yeah, in one sense, it looks really small. But we were able to have. I think we had like a 2-hour dialogue that you can find on YouTube on this. So it's in both of our heads. Like Bill and I are both like, this is a really small distinction, but we could still generate 2 hours of conversation on it. So Craig affirms the relational theory of time, the one that I said was circular and I rejected earlier. So that's one big difference between Craig and I. The other big one is Craig's not willing to say God is time. He thinks that's nuts. Whereas I'm like, I don't know, sounds kind of cool. And here's where where a lot of the stuff matters. So on Craig's view, God is timeless without the universe, and he's temporal with the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question that every philosopher has been asking Craig for, ever since he really posited this view. So since I think it was in maybe the 90s when he first posited this view, I can't quite remember. It was earlier. We're going, what's the relationship between those two phases of God's life? Because it can't be a before and after because it's temporal. And Craig's like, yeah, it's not that. It's not that. And he's like, maybe it's logical. And I'm like, well, it can't be logical because logical priority is consistent with those two phases being like coexistent. So a panentheist is going to say, yeah, God and the universe are co-eternal and God's logically prior. So that's not going to get Craig what he wants. And Craig could say, well, maybe it's causally prior. And I'm like, causes are temporally before their effects. So like,
Mm-hmm.
and he's like, well, maybe I could go with simultaneous causation. I'm like, well, simultaneous that's a temporal relationship, so that can't help. And so what I try to do in the Time Maker book is identify all the different ways where you could try to spell out Craig's view and go, none of these help. And so now I don't know what you could possibly say. There's nothing left to say. So the difference between Craig and I's view in my mind is my view is more coherent. Craig's obviously going to disagree. He's going to give all these arguments for why my view is incoherent. But that's how I see it. Is I've got a very clear and easy to understand way of God exists all alone, and then he exists with a bunch of cosmic stuff. End of story. There's no like weird without and with, and like it's a kind of different like way the phases are related, but you don't understand it. Like you understand my view, and so I'm like, that's great. You can understand my view, whereas a lot of people complain they can't understand Craig on that one point. So I think that's one of the biggest differences.
Do logical moments exist? So I know for many other people, they won't even quite understand, but lots of people posit these idea of logical moments in between things. So they might say that God's knowledge on this is logically prior. So he has these different logical moments that are not temporal. And so, for example, like when I was talking about the other guy who believes in reverse causation, that's also what he's positing in certain other spots. Is like, oh, this is logically prior. Now, I'll give you like one more concrete example that he gives. He actually postulates that the material Earth, water, earth, and space, those are logically prior to the first day of creation. But the first day of creation then happens on, in verse 3 of Genesis 1, but they're not actually prior. So could you parse out a little bit the difference here between logically prior and what you think about logically prior moments?
Let me address the last bit first, and then I'll talk about logical moments. So there's a lot of these different views where people try to do like this backwards causation or God causes stuff from the future and everything. A serious problem with all of them is it's too late. That stuff in the past, it's already been caused. It's too late to cause it later. So what you have is like light came into existence, and then God was like, "Oh, and let there be light." I totally created that, and you're like, "It was already there." You can't. No, that's not how this works. So now let's talk about the logical moments. So I've got this paper it's open access. It just came out earlier this summer. It's called "Does Providence Entail Divine Temporality?" Maybe. The publisher let me get away with that, which was nice. They don't let me be that cheeky. So I talk about all these logical moments in that paper and try to lay it out as clearly as I can and talk about the problems they generate. So here's the idea. So John Duns Scotus, he affirms that God is timeless and he wants to give you this nice account of how God's perfectly free, perfectly rational, how God creates the universe and providentially organizes everything. And he sees, though, all of this stuff, being rational, acting freely, providentially arranging things, that all entails sequence, one thing after another after another. You can't have that if God's timeless. So what do we do? Oh gosh. And Scotus is like, okay, well, let me, before I get to that, let me tell you a different story. Imagine an angel exists for a single moment. That's it. Just pops into existence and is gone. Just moment, boom. Can that angel freely perform a sinful action? And you might be going, that's not enough time to perform a simple, like a sinful action, because a sinful action, you need to like think about it for a second and then be like, yeah, I'm going to do this. And then you do it. And that's a sequence of moments. So Scotus is like, but it's just one temporal moment. What if embedded within this single temporal moment is a series of logical moments? These logical moments have the exact same structure as temporal moments, but they're not time. Trust me, is the statement. I know it looks like it, but it's not. Paul Helm, who affirms divine timelessness, he just goes, these are temporal, stop it. And he's a Calvinist, so he wants, so you would think he should have all these, but he's like, stop it. But Scotus is like, no, trust me, they're not. So what you have in this single temporal moment, at the first logical moment, that's all embedded, the angel's not doing anything. At the second logical moment, the angel's deliberating about different actions he could perform. And at the third logical moment, the angel is like, evil thing. All of that takes place in a single temporal moment. And Scotus is like, if you think that works, now let's talk about God. And he does the same thing with whatever story you want to tell about divine providence, divine freedom. You just make it a single timeless moment, but embedded within it are a series of logical moments. Now, here's the problem. You get eternal contradictions in the life of God, because at the first logical moment, God does not know the future, because there is no future to know. God hasn't even decided if he's going to do anything. Is he going to create or not create? He hasn't decided that. He hasn't deliberated yet. At the next logical moment, he deliberates about whether or not he's even going to create. And then the moment after that, then he's like, yeah, I definitely want to create. Okay, well, what do I want to create? So at the moment after that, and so you've got the series of deliberations that take place over a bunch of different logical moments. And they're all incompatible, because you've got God's not acting and he is acting. God does not know, he does know. All of that is true from eternity. So from all eternity, God does not know and he does know. God does not act and he does act. So from all of eternity, you've got contradictions in God's life. That's not good. You don't want eternal contradictions in the life of God.
I'm roughly speechless. And to be honest, that doesn't happen too often. So with all of that, now that you've killed the timeless God, who's the next person you're going to kill? And I also want to know this. Has anyone else called you the baby-faced assassin?
I think I have heard that one. Yeah. Because a lot of people are surprised about how old I am, and I'm just like, please keep telling me I look young, because I don't like being this old. Yeah, I don't exactly know what the next target is going to be. So there's a couple different book. So one of the book projects I'm working on is called "Letters from a Reluctant Theologian." And it's a series of letters on like just kind of like very short essays on like what exactly is theology, why is the doctrine of God so controversial, and then I get a bunch of my friends to write short essays as well on like the blessing and overthinking your theology, the blessing and curse of being a philosopher, and like struggles of like mental health and faith and resurrection and providence and like in forgiveness. So like a bunch of short essays on these kind of things that are going to be very popular level, very vulnerable, very funny, is the idea. So that's one thing I'm going to be doing. And then the next really, really big academic book project is going to be on problems of creation. So I want to look at all the different models of God and ask two important questions. why would God create anything at all? And then why would God create this particular universe? And I want to see how do the different models of God answer that question, because I think some of them just cannot answer at all. And so that's pretty bad. So I want to say classical theism can't answer either of those questions. Other models of God can, but they encounter other kinds of issues that pop up. And so I want to try to figure out like what comes out on top. I don't know yet. I don't know.
See, your common sense approach is something that is awesome and annoys me at the same time. It annoys me in the sense that some of these arguments concerning, let's take divine simplicity, for example, like before I've even heard of you and your arguments, I was giving some of those arguments and basically expressing why I felt like simplicity was incoherent, doesn't work, and those things. But it's only once somebody who's brilliant and has a PhD articulates the common sense notion, like that doesn't make any sense, that people are like, oh, that's a good point. And it's like, did it seem like an obvious point before? And they're
I
like, I
said it
had no
before.
idea.
Why?
Yeah.
This is something I've encountered a lot, especially since I started doing all these YouTube videos. And then like when I do like a TikTok live or something, like, or a Discord chat, like people, their intuitions are there. It's not always well thought out or well defined, but like it's there. My wife and I, we created this comedy show called "Is God a Psychopath?" And it's obviously trying to get a lot of attention, we needed to fill a room on a Saturday night, and we did. It was great. So what I did was my book on God and emotion. It had not come out yet, but because I was still like kind of finishing it. And so we created these Tinder profiles for two different deities that you might want to worship. Do you want to swipe right or left on? So what we do is we ask the audience, we just read the profiles. And so one is an impassible God. He's is a classical theist God. And the other one is a passible deity. It could be like neoclassical or open or something like that. Didn't want to complicate things too much. And so I just have the audience like vote one way or the other. They give me an amen if they want this God. They would give me a hallelujah if they want the other God. And then I'm like, okay, now let's play devil's advocate for an hour. And then at the end, we'll do a vote again to see if people have changed their views. And so I'd ask people in the audience, be like, now, why did you vote this particular way? And they'd give me whatever their reason is. And then I kind of develop the argument a bit and then play devil's advocate. But I was playing God's advocate because I've got two different deities. So there's a lot of jokes in there. But I've done this show a few different times. I did it in Scotland. I did it a couple places in the US. What I noticed is every time I did it, I was able to get through almost every single argument in the book, God and Emotion. And I would planted a couple of questions in the audience, but for the most part, the audience is just doing it themselves. They have the ideas there. You just need to prompt them a little bit and they can think about it. And all I'm doing is just, polishing it up a little bit, making it sound a little bit more academic. But yeah, you're right. Like I'm just pointing out stuff that other people noticed.
Yeah, it's so crazy to me. And I feel like you have got to write a book at this point that is basically, let's see, the psychopath that murders time, simplicity, and you've got to add a third topic in there. The theological psychopath that murders time.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. We'll think about it. Yeah.
So that would be a good one.
Yeah.
And with the way you present yourself, so it would just be quite classical and comical. In fact, actually, you know what you remind me of? And then you just have to have the picture of the Among Us, right? Among Us little, I don't know, icon or something. Go. Yeah. Well, Dr. Mullins, thank you so much for your time. Mm-hmm. I've really enjoyed our talk, and I really think it'll be beneficial to others. This was good. So, but yeah, I'll be sure to post a bunch of your links and books in the description so others can find you. And do you have any last thoughts on time? What is it that we should be thinking about or moving forward?
I guess the question is this: if you find yourself like really addicted to all of this philosophy and theology stuff, so I teach this online master's program at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland, and it's in philosophy and theology, and we look at Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy, and so you get this robust education in like the whole history of ideas, and then we get into the contemporary stuff. And so if you just find yourself going, I need to know more, but I don't want to break the bank because I don't have like money to pay for like an American like university. Well, that's okay, because Switzerland, they're like, they have this thing called like taking pride in their higher education, so they subsidize it. So like the program's actually like really really cheap by American standards. So if you find yourself just going, I need to know more about all of this stuff, I can't sit here idly by. I'm like, okay, that's cool. Come talk to me, and you can come study with me possibly.